there, storytellers! Welcome back to my channel. Today's video, as you can tell from the title down below, is going to be my 5x5 review of The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with my 5x5 style reviews, I'm going to share with you 5 things I enjoyed about this novel and 5 things I didn't. I will warn you in advance that a lot of the things I didn't like are very intertwined and partly intertwined with things I did like. So without any further ado, let's get into this review. So first things first, let's talk about the plot of this book a little bit. This follows 2 timelines, one in present day and one in 18th century London. And the 18th century timeline follows our main character, Nella, and a side character / main character, Eliza, who comes into her life. Nella is an apothecary who followed in her mother's footsteps initially as an apothecary, healing women. But after some wrong has been done to her in her past, Nella ends up dispensing poisons on behalf of women who have been wronged by men. She makes a vow to never harm another woman. So that is the premise of her apothecary shop, is that it's hidden, it's tucked away in a little known street in London, and that those who hear about it will only know how to find her if they've been told by a friend, so that no one can accidentally stumble upon it. And it is there that Eliza enters her life looking for poison on behalf of her mistress, the woman that she works for, and it's to be dispensed to her mistress's husband. That kicks off our 18th century plot. In present-day London, we follow Caroline, who is in London after some marital difficulties with her husband. It was supposed to be a couple's trip for their anniversary, but she decides to leave the States and go on her own, go on an adventure, and just try to rediscover herself and rediscover her priorities for their relationship. It is there in current London where she goes mudlarking and finds a vial that has just the symbol of a bear on it, nothing else. But something about the vial captures her interest, and she starts digging into where the vial came from, who it belonged to, and its past. And it is there that she starts to connect the dots between herself and Nella's past apothecary. And given the sort of the women share similar backstories in a way, and it's that and the vial that tie them together, and it becomes eventually a little more intertwined in terms of the plot. But let's get into what I disliked about it, because I like to start with the things I don't like, and then we'll get into what I liked. Oh, I also just want to state that this is Sarah Penner's debut novel, so I think the fact that she tackled a dual timeline, one of which is set in the past, is a pretty big mouthful to chew, and overall I think she executed it well. I liked it. I'm still not entirely sure how I want to rate it. I want to say maybe 3 or 4 stars. I'm not sold, and I will get into why in a second. So, dislike number 1. For a murderous apothecary, Nella is kind of boring. She is someone who's, at this point, done this for so long that she's just over it when we meet her, and that kind of makes her really boring. She kind of doesn't want to be doing it anymore, and you get that feeling from her, but she doesn't see another way out for herself either. So she doesn't really want to be dispensing poisons, and she's just kind of apathetic about things and life in general, and that really is a hard way to kick off a story. It made her kind of hard to read. Dislike number 2, also about Nella, but specifically the order in which her story unfolds. It's alluded to from the very beginning that Nella has suffered a slight at the hands of a man in her past that kick-started this poisoning business where she kills men for women. And we don't really get the story till close to halfway, and even then it's just relayed. It's not shown. I would have preferred personally a flashback in which we could see it play out on all of its emotional turmoil glory, if that makes sense. I kind of wanted to see that which sparked her anger and her passion and caused her to start deviating from the path her mother set for her, which was just a purely healing apothecary business and not a murderous one. So I just felt like if you're going to make that big of a jump in a character at any point in their life, whether we hear about it in the current as it's happening or, you know, we get it in a backstory, I feel like I just needed to be involved in that moment a little bit more strongly than we were. Dislike number 3, this one's slightly nitpicky, but the dual timeline jumped pretty much every chapter, and for me, that just slowed the action down a little bit, especially in the beginning. Towards the middle, toward end of the book, it picks up and it's not as noticeable, but towards the beginning, it's a lot of non-thing. I mean, things are going on, it's building, but it's building really slowly, and the jumping back and forth just kind of cut off action as it was happening, it felt like to me. So I would have preferred to get maybe 2 of Caroline's chapters and 2 of Nella's chapters and leaving them more on bigger cliffhangers, if you will, before you get another of their chapters, if that makes any sense. I just felt like it stunted the action a little bit in the beginning, and I would have liked to see a little bit less of it. Once the action picks up, I don't mind it going back and forth as much, but when you're just building to it, it kind of takes a while and it makes it harder to connect to either of the characters. Dislike number 4, kind of piggybacking off of that thought, the book is slow in the beginning. I will not hesitate to say so. I am somebody who likes to stick with books. I don't necessarily like to DNF them because I think most books have something that you can enjoy in them if you're just willing to be patient. If you're full on hating something, I'm not against DNFing it, but there was enough of intrigue there that I felt like I wanted to keep going. I felt like there was more, but in the same sense, a reader who's a little less patient than I am might not be patient enough to wait for the halfway mark for the novel to pick up. And if you're one of those readers, just know that going into it. If this book is something that's been on your radar and you're intrigued by, I do think it's worth picking up, but I also think that you just need to go into it knowing that the halfway mark is kind of where it picks up. Dislike number 5, and this is more a modern woman's dislike versus maybe a woman who in the past would be reading this story, and I'll explain. I dislike that many of the women in this story, including Caroline, are women who don't really have a sense of identity or autonomy until a man has done something to them to sort of change that, or until the man is gone from their life, you know, because like I said, Nella's poisoning men, they're dying. So a lot of these women don't have agency or authority or drive to live their life the way they want to until a man is gone from their life. And in the past, I kind of get it, that's kind of historically accurate. Women didn't have a lot of agency when they were under a man's household because the men technically owned them. But as a modern reader, that was just a little frustrating to read, especially in Caroline, who is supposed to be a more modern woman. I just, it frustrated me that she was a little bit lost to a man, if that makes sense. Anyway, let's move on to the likes. Like number 1, on the flip side of what I literally just said about Caroline, I do enjoy that the second she kind of decides she doesn't want to see her husband right now, she just goes off and just starts reigniting her past passions that she buried, and she starts to come to the conclusion that while he was definitely a role player in her putting those passions away and putting them to the side in favor of the life they had planned together, she realizes that she also allowed him to do it. She played a part as well, and I appreciated that she is willing and able to acknowledge that she wasn't just acted upon. She helped instigate her own unhappiness within their marriage, and he just sort of caused a revelation moment by doing what he did. Like number 2, I really enjoy the fact that Eliza, while 12 years old, is a really intelligent, smart, kind of curious, action-oriented character. I'm not quite sure how to describe her, but my main like about Eliza is that while she is curious and smart, she is still 12. She still doesn't fully understand the concepts of the world. She kind of knows of them, but she doesn't understand because she hasn't practically experienced them herself. And I really liked that balance within her character. She's a little bit smarter than your average 12-year-old, but she's still 12 and things still scare her and she still doesn't quite understand. And I think that character, especially her age, was written really well, especially given the fact that she's kind of a big role player in Nella's story. She manages to be very wise and still a scared 12-year-old at certain points. I think the balance was struck really well. Like that character a lot. Like number 3, as I've mentioned, men sort of are catalysts in this story. They instigate the action of the women by doing some kind of wrong to them, and this spurs the women on. But I like that despite the fact that the men are catalysts for events that happen in the story, it's ultimately a story about women sort of finding themselves and finding their strengths and rediscovering sort of who they are without their identity being tied to the man in their life. I like that ultimately that's what this story is about. Like number 4, despite the fact that I found her very hard to read from the beginning, I initially thought it was because I didn't like the way the narrator was doing her voice, but it ultimately just was, I didn't like the way her story was progressing, at least in the beginning. Nella, despite the fact that I have some qualms with her in the beginning, is a really good representation of what happens when you hold on to the past, when you let your past pains dictate the future course of your life. Nella has something done wrong to her when she's a young woman, probably somewhere in her 20s, I would imagine, at the latest. And she lets her grief over that event and an event that had just happened prior to it. I don't want to spoil it for you because it is kind of the point of her story. So if I say it, it'll ruin it for you. But she lets those wounds fester and it dictates the next choice she makes and every other choice she makes after that. And she's a really good representation of how letting those wounds fester and just letting the world happen to you instead of, you know, making peace with your pain and growing from it, eats you alive from the inside out. When we meet her, she is quite literally kind of like a crumbling building. She's not in the best of health. She doesn't feel good physically or mentally. And she's at this point, like I said, where she's over it. And you can just see that it seeped the life out of her because she couldn't move on for the longest time. And then by the time she got to the point where she maybe could, it was just kind of pointless. She had wasted her life on a grudge. So I like that representation. I think in that respect, she's a really successful character. Like number 5, like I said, the second half of the book. I like the second half of the book. It picked up in action. There was a lot more emotion and sense of urgency and a lot more going on with each of the characters and each of the timelines that made it far more exciting to get through. And the first half of the book seemed to take too long, and I considered stopping it a couple times, but I kept pushing forward, and the second half of the book is very good, in my opinion. I like that the action picks up and that you get to have that sense of like, I went into this book, it's about a killer apothecary, right? I expected a little bit of emotional drama and a sense of urgency and secrecy and all this stuff, and I didn't get it in the first half of the book. You get it a little bit more in the second half, especially in regard to Caroline's story, but I really like that it picks up. That's like number 5. I like that you get it eventually. I do, however, like I said, wish that we got a little bit more of that urgency and a little bit more of the sort of sneaky, urgent backstory of Nella's past. I just wanted a little bit more urgency throughout the entire book instead of just at the second half, but I do really like the second half. But that is it for my 5x5 review of The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. Like I said, it's her debut novel, so I think it's a really good effort for a debut novel. I think she has a lot of strengths that she will definitely play to in books she writes down the line. I do think a dual timeline with kind of pacing issues is a lot to tackle in a debut novel. So the fact that she did it as well as she did is pretty impressive and bodes well for future works. I do think, like I said, to be aware of the pacing issue and the fact that I think the dual timeline adds to the issue in some spots is just something to be aware of going into it. Nella's not my favorite character. I could have liked her more if I got a little bit more of her. Maybe her when she was younger, if we got a little bit more of that, even if it was just in like her sitting there remembering. She kind of does it, but not in moments that are interesting, in moments that are more sentimental. So, I mean, that's nice, but I would have rather seen her remembering doing dark deeds and stuff. I expected her part of the story to be a little bit spookier than it was. So know that going into it. But that is it. If you have read this novel and you want to share your thoughts with me, let me know down in the comments below what you thought of it. Do you agree with any of my assessments if you've read it? If you haven't read it, are you planning to, or did anything I say deter you from reading it at all? Let me know down below. But for now, I'm going to get going. If you want to keep up with me and all of my bookish adventures, you can go ahead and click the subscribe button. And as always, I highly recommend that you ring the little bell so that you don't miss a beat. It will notify you every time I post a video, which usually is every Friday, but we are approaching October. The next video would have been, I think, October 1st, but I am going to do what I did last year, which is Bookaween. I called it Vlogaween last year, but I realized how silly is that? It's a channel about books. It should be called Bookaween. So we are doing Bookaween, and if you are unfamiliar with it, it is 31 days of bookish videos going through the entire month of October. I'm very excited about it. I have it planned. I have stuff started, I started filming already, so things are in the works. Definitely ring the bell so that you get notified every day in October when I post a new video. But for now, I'm going to go. I will see you guys on the next one. Bye!